I'm a global macro investor, and my work revolves around understanding economics, markets, politics, and geopolitics, all of which are deeply interconnected. Right now, there are three monumental shifts happening in our lifetimes, unlike anything we've seen before. To fully grasp their significance, I've studied similar periods in history. Here's what they are. 1. The creation of massive debt and money. Governments and central banks are creating unprecedented amounts of debt and printing money at scales we've never seen. 2. Internal conflict over money and values. There's increasing division within societies about how resources should be distributed and disagreements over core values. 3. A changing world order. Countries like China and Russia are challenging the global dominance of the United States, creating geopolitical tensions that are reshaping the world. Let's dive into the first shift, debt and money creation. At its core, everyone agrees we need more spending to fuel economic growth. However, if you spend more than you earn, you need to borrow, and borrowing creates debt. Initially, debt feels like an increase in buying power. It's credit, after all. But debt needs to be repaid. When repayment begins, it reduces buying power, which can depress the economy. To counteract this, central banks often print money and buy back debt. While this might seem like a solution, it leads to the depreciation of currency values. Here's what happened recently. A significant amount of money and credit was distributed, giving people more buying power. At first, this felt great, people were spending more. But there's a catch. When too much money chases too few goods, prices rise. That's inflation. The truth is straightforward. If the total money and credit used for spending increases faster than the quantity of goods produced, prices go up. You can even calculate the changes in prices with this formula. The Federal Reserve and the government work together to flood the economy with money, causing a wave of inflation. Depending on the measure, inflation reached around 7.5% year over year, or even closer to 12% using core inflation rates. While some influences are temporary, the primary driver is the sheer amount of spending. What does this mean for you? When inflation rises faster than your income, you lose buying power. It's a silent tax on your wealth, and yet, for some reason, people often find it more acceptable than other economic consequences. Understanding these shifts is essential to navigating today's economic challenges. These changes, debt creation, societal conflict, and a changing world order, are defining our era. What are your thoughts on these shifts? Let's discuss in the comments. Understanding inflation and the loss of buying power. When the government prints money and distributes it, like sending out checks, it feels more acceptable than directly raising taxes or taking money from someone's pocket. Why? Because if taxes are raised, people immediately notice and complain. But with money printing, the effect is subtler. Even though it ultimately has the same outcome, it reduces your buying power. Let's consider bond funds and money market funds as examples. Holders of these assets might think they're safe, but they've been losing significant buying power. Here's how. Bond funds are down about 10%. Inflation is up roughly 8%. Combined, that's an 18% loss in buying power. Now, many people associate inflation with higher prices. But this perspective is often misleading. It's not just about paying more. Inflation doesn't give us more goods or better services. It redistributes resources, often bidding essentials out of reach for some people, particularly those with fewer means. For the average person, this manifests as losing buying power due to inflation, facing higher prices for everyday goods. The Federal Reserve's response to combat inflation. The Federal Reserve is tightening monetary policy, raising interest rates to reduce spending, reducing the availability of money and credit. While these measures aim to curb inflation, they squeeze the economy in several ways. 1. Higher prices reduce what people can afford. 2. Higher interest rates increase debt servicing costs. 3. Credit becomes less accessible, making it harder for individuals and businesses to spend or invest. This economic squeeze is reminiscent of what happened during the 1970s paradigm shift. How paradigm shifts unfold. These shifts take time because people's mindsets are slow to adapt. For instance, Investors often see cash as a safe asset, but they overlook how inflation erodes its value. When inflation becomes apparent, they shift away from cash or bonds and invest in other assets, further driving inflation. These changes ripple through the economy, influencing costs like compensation and the overall cost of living. In essence, we're in a period of adjustment, where inflation and monetary tightening are reshaping how we think about money, savings, and investments. Understanding these dynamics is crucial to navigating this challenging environment. The pendulum of inflation and mindsets. In periods of low inflation, people don't give much thought to protecting themselves against it. They don't ask, do I have an inflation-linked contract for my work? Or, do I have enough inflation-resistant assets? Instead, they focus on storing wealth in things like houses or other tangible assets. But as inflation starts to rise, it creates a self-reinforcing cycle. People's actions, like shifting their investments, fuel more inflation, which then changes their mindset. This pendulum swing from one perspective to another can be dramatic. Take the 1970s, for example. In the beginning, people were caught off guard by rising inflation. Over time, inflation became so entrenched that many believed it would never end. Then, the central bank took extreme measures to combat it, surprising everyone. This led to the opposite scenario in the 1980s, with falling inflation. High real interest rates. As a result, bonds, terrible assets to own in the 1970s, became some of the best performing assets in the 1980s. Political polarization and populism were also seeing a shift in political dynamics. The level of polarization today is the highest since 1900, and compromise is at its lowest point. Voting across party lines is almost non-existent. Instead, two monolithic groups are at war with one another. This polarization is fueled by populism, where people feel they must choose a side. When the causes people support become more important than the system itself, the system is at risk. Traditionally, democracy is built on compromise, where the rule of law and the system take precedence. But throughout history, be it the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, or Chinese Revolution, moderates who seek compromise are often marginalized or eliminated. Today, we're witnessing similar dynamics. For instance, Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter could potentially have a greater societal impact than decisions made by the Supreme Court. This is a clear symptom of how power dynamics are shifting. The principle of worry. I have a principle. If you worry, you don't have to worry. If you don't worry, then you should worry. Why? Because worrying forces you to think about historical patterns, anticipate potential conflicts, and prepare for what's likely to happen. If we consider the lessons of history, we might avoid the terrible conflicts that have torn societies apart in the past. A lesson from Singapore. I recently visited Singapore, and their approach offers a stark contrast to ours. They have substantial savings, and the income generated from these savings covers 20% of their national budget. This means one generation is leaving the next with financial security, a strong education system, civility. What are we leaving for future generations? Massive debts, a crumbling infrastructure, deep societal divisions. The pendulum of history swings between extremes, whether it's inflation, political ideologies, or economic approaches. By understanding these patterns and worrying about their consequences, we can take steps to mitigate the challenges ahead. A vision for stability and progress. The answer to many of our challenges is straightforward. If we work together, remain productive, and earn more than we spend, we'll avoid many problems. But achieving that requires effort and structural changes. If I were President of the United States, here's what I'd focus on. 1. Bipartisan leadership. I'd form a bipartisan cabinet to bring moderates from both sides together. The goal would be to reduce polarization and foster collaboration. 2. An economic Manhattan Project. I'd assemble the smartest minds, across political lines, to develop a comprehensive economic plan. This plan would focus on growing the economic pie and dividing it fairly by expanding equal opportunities for everyone, encouraging productivity and innovation. The cycle of power and order. History shows that societies are governed by systems, or orders, designed by those in power. These systems typically change through conflict, often wars, which reshape power dynamics and force new agreements. For example, after World War II, the United States emerged as the dominant global power. It held 80% of the world's gold reserves, controlled half of the global economy, and possessed unmatched military strength. This dominance established the American world order, where institutions like the United Nations, IMF, and World Bank were anchored in U.S. influence. The war also acted as a great equalizer. Soldiers returned to a society with reduced wealth gaps, less resentment, and a sense of shared purpose. This laid the groundwork for a period of peace and prosperity, driven by cooperation. A capitalist system that rewarded good ideas and productivity. Capitalism's dual nature. While capitalism fosters innovation and growth, it also creates challenges. 1. Wealth gaps. Success breeds inequality. Those with more wealth can access better education and opportunities for their children, perpetuating disparities. 2. Indebtedness. As wealth grows, so do debt levels, often leading to problems down the road. The cycle of dominance. When a nation becomes the world's dominant power, certain patterns emerge: increased global trade and influence, the spread of its currency and economic system worldwide. But history tells us that this dominance doesn't last forever. The Dutch and British empires faced similar cycles, rising to global prominence before eventual decline due to overreach, internal challenges, and rising competition. The path forward to sustain peace, prosperity, and global leadership, we must address the inequalities and resentments capitalism can create. By fostering equal opportunities, reducing wealth gaps, and managing debt responsibly, we can build a system that works for everyone, one that doesn't rely on conflict to reset the order. If you enjoyed this and want more insightful content, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Stay tuned for more updates, ideas, and valuable discussions.